Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Is Data the Answer to Equitable and Inclusive Clinical Trials? I'm Julia Douthart with Fierce Biotech, and I will moderate today's discussion. To get us started, I'm delighted to welcome today's panelist, Sarah Thompson-Schick, Counsel, FDA Regulatory and Compliance at Reed Smith, Stacy Ripken, Vice President of Strategic Insights for H1, and Alexandra Moons, Director of Product Marketing for H1. You can read their full bios on the left side of your screen using the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. This webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there's no dial-in number. So for your best audio quality, turn your computer sound up. This webinar is being recorded and it'll be available on demand within 24 hours after we conclude. And after our panel discussion, which we'll open with here in a minute, there will be time for Q&A. So go ahead and submit your questions using the Q&A tab on the left side of your screen at any time during this webinar. All right, so welcome panelists. To get us started, I want to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, maybe tell us a little bit about your background, your experiences, what brought you to the panel today. We can start with Sarah.
Hi, thank you, Julia. It's really great to be here this morning, this afternoon with everyone. As you all saw, I'm a lawyer, and the question that I know, especially before FDA guidance and the recent omnibus bill was passed at the end of 2022, a lot of folks would ask, why are lawyers even interested in this conversation? Why does this matter? I spend a lot of time in my practice advising medical products companies on clinical trials issues and making sure that they are ready to go with FDA with the proper data and making sure that there is appropriate representation in that data. I had some experiences with clients that have struggled with the issue of clinical trial diversity and how to achieve it. And that has actually gotten me even more interested and involved in this particular topic. I recently co-authored a paper with a colleague that was published in the Food and Drug Law Journal in October of last year, really thinking about how there could potentially be regulatory incentives introduced around improving and encouraging clinical trial diversity. And there's a lot in this space for us to tackle now, anticipating more guidance from FDA and increasing requirements for industry sponsors. So this is something that I keep track of, and also through the lens of someone with a clinical operations background. Before I even became a lawyer, I worked in the project management world at a couple of CROs, project management on the clinical trial side, plus also health outcomes research. And so thinking about this from a legal perspective, but also thinking about how important it is to engage the folks that are involved in clinical operations, the investigators, the study staff, the vendors. This is just a really important and dynamic topic that has a number of stakeholders, and lawyers just so happen to be a part of that conversation now. But it doesn't have to be so scary. I think this is a really exciting topic, and I think that there's so many people that will be involved in this discussion and to help us move this area forward, and really excited to talk about this more today. I'll turn it back over to you, Julia.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Stacy?
Hi, everybody. Excited to be here this afternoon. My name is Stacy Rifkin. I am the Group Vice President of Strategic Insights here at H1. My team is really responsible for making sure that our partners get the insights that they need from the data that we share, whether that's inside our platform with our underlying data or from the people. And I lead a team of subject matter experts, which speaks to my previous background in industry. So I came to H1 after about 20 years in pharma, where I spent most of my career focused on expert identification, profiling, and strategy. And at that axis of expert identification, profiling, and strategy was always who are the people we're working with on clinical trials, and balancing those needs of experts with diversity and experience in clinical trials. So part of this is me coming to the table with my background in pharma and partnering with my clinical development colleagues. And part of my experience here comes from partnering with our clients who are trying to answer these questions every day and adapt to the new landscape where we really do need to not only put patients first, but put diversity at the center of what we're doing.
Excellent. Thank you. Alexandra?
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm super excited to be joining this webinar today and to have this discussion. As my name is Alexandra Moons, I'm actually from Europe. I'm located in Belgium. I'm a PharmD, as you might have seen. And from my perspective here, it is really important to look at things from the patient side of things. What I really mean there is, as a PharmD, I really was on the front line. I worked with patients, and I heard their concerns of, I don't really trust certain medications that I'm supposed to be taking. Could you reassure me? And by then going into industry and really working with companies on how do we get clinical trials up and going, but also what are some of those burdens that we see within the clinical space, I think the diversity section immediately jumped out as something that everyone was aware of. We need to try and fix something around it, but no one really knew how to start tackling that problem. And so that was one of the main reasons that I got so passionate about it. For what do I bring to the table as such is just that experience of what we see within the patient side of things, but also what we see across the world. And we start by addressing this problem from a US perspective, just because the FDA has been kind of like leading the conversation with guidelines and stuff like that. But I think it's important that we are taking this problem and tackling it from a global level, because this isn't just the US that is struggling with this. It is Europe, it is Asia, it is Africa, it's everywhere. And it's really important that we understand what diversity means in each of those regions and that we try to find solutions in order to help patients at the end of the line, because those are the people that really need our help. Those are the people that really are asking for a change. And it's up to us to really come together and bring our minds together in how we can facilitate that change.
All right. So to get us started here, to lay some groundwork, what is the most recent legislative guidance, for example, the omnibus bill, specifically related to clinical trials and diversity? And for all of you, why has it taken the federal guidelines? Why has it taken federal guidelines to begin to turn the conversation toward pharma and health equity? So kind of what's been lacking? I thought maybe we could open with Sarah, who might be able to tell us a little bit about the omnibus bill, and then.
Sure. I mean, even starting back before the omnibus bill, the FDA released a draft guidance in April 2022 about diversity plans, particularly when sponsors are getting ready to start up a phase 3 or just otherwise pivotal study, to have a diversity plan ready to submit to FDA. And there are various elements that FDA would be looking for for sponsors to include around their plans for diversity, for enrollment, for retention, the spread of diversity, all of that. And then the DEPICT Act, which has been around for quite some time, has also had this element of a diversity plan. And that was part of what was folded into the omnibus bill at the end of this year. And it essentially codified having a diversity plan, requiring FDA to provide those specifics and finalize the guidance for the diversity plan. So a lot of us who are following this issue will be looking for that final guidance in the next few months. Along with that, there was also legislation in the omnibus bill related to decentralized clinical trials, and FDA will be required to issue at least draft guidance around that, probably something that will occur later this year. And in thinking about the why do we have this legislation? Why are we requiring this now, or why is this required now? Um, for at least the last 10, 15 years, FDA has always taken the approach of diversity is a good thing. It's encouraged. It should happen. We should have diverse patient populations in clinical trials. And there have been a number of initiatives that the agency has undertaken, different dialogues through the Office of Minority Health and other stakeholder conversations that have occurred over the last several years. There's also been guidance back in I believe it was October 2016, guidance issued around how to develop inclusion-exclusion criteria for clinical trials so that there could be more inclusion in the study and making sure that we're not excluding certain groups of people, right? But all of it has come from a place of we recommend or we encourage. And there, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there seemed to be a lot more attention paid to this issue of diversity in clinical trials, because now you have this very significant vaccine for a very big deal pandemic that the public health officials want the general population to take. And the questions that were coming up were, well, did you study this vaccine in groups of people that looked like me? These were questions that really started to come up. The discussions around mistrust in the healthcare system also arose as well. And so really making sure that we are being representative, that doctors, that patients can have candid conversations with each other about the data that are being collected in these studies, and to understand as a patient that you are indeed represented in these data, and here's how. Those are the conversations that patients and doctors want to have, and having legislation around this, having FDA guidance will only further encourage those conversations to occur as we move forward.
Yeah, I can add to Sarah's comments. I think that for a long time, nobody was forced to explore the questions of, are these medicines that are coming to market going to work the same in patients of different backgrounds? And if the question wasn't asked, then it can be understood why nobody tried to run trials with a more diverse patient cohort. As soon as we started asking those questions, and as soon as we started exposing differences in how patients of different backgrounds were responding to medicines, and as the technology and science improved and we could see that there were biomarkers that really were able to identify different patients and how they would respond, you can understand where the motivations would have to change. There's always going to be a push to get trials done faster and smarter. But if we're not testing it in the right population, we've learned now what the impact would be when you go to market. And so you've got a little bit of a carrot and a little bit of a stick there, right? There's got to be the right motivations, and not just, a punishment for doing something wrong. But once we understand that if we actually can identify where these medicines are working best for patients, that's going to lead to better outcomes for everybody. And so I think that the science and the policy have come together there. And, should it have been sooner and earlier? Of course. But now that the science is really there, that conclusively can show that we need to be looking for outcomes within distinct patient populations, now there's no question that the policy has to be there as well.
Yeah, and I can add to that actually. If I look at what my colleagues here have already said, one of the things that really stood out there is we all now know that we need to do something, but it is sometimes it's also hard to really put some measurements in place if we don't know exactly why we're doing it. As in, we know now why we're doing it. It's important from a scientific perspective. But if you listen to the pharmaceutical companies, especially the clinical teams, and if you listen to them saying, okay, trials are already getting more expensive, they are already taking more time than they used to take. It's something that we've seen over the past decades improving or increasing even more. Then why are we going to be making our lives even harder by now also focusing on diverse patient populations? Because we already know that one of the biggest pain points we have is the recruitment process itself. And so I think it's really important now that not just saying, okay, we know that it's necessary, but having those guidelines and really having a push there of saying, you don't just need to be aware of it, you actually have to act on it. And there are consequences of not acting on it. That itself is really what is driving this next stage of we expect to see big changes because we now have the background of why we need to do it. We have the background of, yes, there are going to be consequences. And now the next step is let's try and fix it. And that's where we really have to put our brains together into what does fixing it mean. That's where that guideline in April really helped to say, okay, if you're talking about diversity and bringing diversity into the trial, this is the plan that you should be focused on. You need to figure out what you're going to be measuring against. You have to figure out what your operational measures are going to be. And then you also have to execute against that. And so I think those steps are kind of required in order for companies to start saying now, yes, we can do this. We now know what we're going to be, what is kind of expected of us. And now the next step is actually executing against it.
So as we were preparing for this discussion, the concept of A, B, C, and D's came up around clinical trial diversity, equity, access and inclusion, awareness, burden, competence, disqualification. And I'm wondering, I actually start with Alexandra, because that is who brought this up in our pre-call. If you could elaborate a bit on this concept, and we could talk about it a bit.
Yeah, of course. So we always talk about diversity and the issues of diversity. I think it's important that, again, we take a step back and look at what is driving the lack of diversity from a patient perspective. And so when we asked patients, a couple of things really came up. Awareness. A lot of patients are interested in participation. They just don't know that they can. Deloitte did a study on this, actually. And so what we heard there was that they said, okay, 85% of patients are potentially interested in participation, but they didn't even know that that was an option for them. So having that awareness of potential participation is super valuable, because at least they know that that option exists for them. The B stands for burden. And I think a lot of cases, what we figured out is the burden of trial participation is often just misunderstood or underrepresented. Sure, there is in most cases some sort of financial some sort of financial ingestion, or just to make sure that people are potentially being compensated for their time. It's not just the time, it is, the full method of, you have to be aware of the burden of participation. Most of us are luckily, we have healthcare insurance. We can take time off in case we need to go to the doctor. A lot of patients, especially the minority groups that are underrepresented today in clinical trials, don't have that luxury. And so understanding what burden really means for them, either being away from their family, being away from their work, is that something that they can actually do? How does that impact their lives? But also the burden of the medication side effects. All of those things need to be taken into consideration in order to better understand whether that burden is something that patients are going to be able to live with, basically. And in some cases, that really literally means living with it, being able to survive if they participate. or if they don't participate. So all of that needs to be taken much better into consideration. C stands for confidence. And I think the confidence level is something that we really need to be much more aware of. When we talk about pharma, in most cases, especially outside of the pharma industry, when do people hear about pharmaceutical companies? Either it's because they have launched a huge drug that they're going to be making a lot of money with, and that is coming at a really high price that no one can properly explain to patients why that price is set like that, or it is because they have either purchased another company, an acquisition, or a third factor would be because they've done something wrong and some patients are suing them because of the side effects of a drug. So, from a logical human perspective, you can't really blame patients for having a lack of confidence in the pharmaceutical industry. When we look at COVID pandemic, why did a lot of patients say no to the vaccine? Because they didn't trust what the company or even government was potentially putting into the vaccines. So that lack of trust is something that we need to tackle really from the beginning in order to help our customers or our the pharmaceutical companies, as well as the patients at the end of the line, really see that their pharma is trying to bring good into this world, and they're not just in it for the money. And then D stands for disqualification. I think this was already brought up a little bit before by Sarah. In a lot of cases, unintentional disqualification of patients is one of the big reasons why we don't really see a lot of minority patients being entered into the trial. They might be screened for it, but what often happens is because of underlying conditions or other kind of side effects that they might be having from different drugs, or just in general, just for being who they are, just being burdened with other diseases as well, is in a lot of cases a reason for disqualification from a trial. So being less stringent in those inclusion or exclusion criteria is not necessarily the question here, but being more aware of the underlying diseases and the underlying disease burdens that minority populations might be suffering from is key to bring those patients into the study. And if we're being really honest, the people who are planning to be getting the treatment at the end of the line, they're suffering from all of these side conditions as well. So if we're really trying to measure safety and effectiveness of a drug, then we should be taking those people into consideration from the clinical stages, because at least then we know exactly what the effects are going to be for the end receiving patient pool.
So awareness, burden, confidence, disqualification. Which of these areas, if you were to really highlight, I'm talking to Sarah and Stacy, might you really focus on, or are they all just of the same importance? I know awareness is something that a lot of people are focusing on now. Do you have any comment?
I would say that burden is an area of consistent discussion, especially in thinking about, and this conversation has come up a lot, and I would love Stacy and Alexandra for you all to chime in with your thoughts as well, because I think this is important to think about relative to how we are, or to what extent do we think about patient remuneration, and how do we compensate, if we compensate, to what extent do we compensate? I think there's a lot of ethical analysis, there's legal analysis, there are a number of obviously financial analyses as well. The patients who are having difficulty with traveling to and from the site, the patients who have to leave work early, who have to spend a significant time at the site, especially depending on the type of clinical trial. So if it's an oncology study and you're getting an infusion, are you there for half a day and you're missing a half a day of work potentially? If you are caring for children, if you're caring for older adults, what does that look like? There are a lot of questions that are there that I think the burden conversation is one that we continue to struggle with. And how do we fix that? Obviously, there's the conversation around decentralized clinical trials and meeting patients where they are, or having a hybrid type situation where the patient only goes into a physical physician office a couple of times during the trial, but they may have the ability to do at-home visits or utilize other types of technology. So that is a solution that a lot of folks have been using these days. I think that there's a lot more information and guidance around that is to come from FDA. And there will also be questions around validating some of the tools that are used in that context to make sure that they actually are doing what they say they do as far as the data collection is concerned. But that is a continuous question of how do we solve it? How do we ease the burden? Maybe it's not completely erased, but how do we at least ease it to make a clinical trial more of a reasonable or interesting option for diverse populations?
Yeah, to add to what Sarah said, I agree, I would have picked burden as well. And what is interesting is how quickly the conversation's accelerating, because as soon as I'm asked to support finding sites that have access to diverse patients, the follow-up question I'm getting is, and what about social determinants of health? So it's actually really gratifying to see that the conversation can expand that quickly, so that people are not just thinking about now just the person in the abstract who is diverse, who will meet my diversity plan, but thinking about what are those social determinants of health that are impacting that patient that I really do need to consider when planning this trial. So it has been both surprising and gratifying to see how quickly we're expanding the definition of diversity beyond just somebody's background to really understand what those social determinants of health, what that burden is going to be on the patient, and how we're going to address it.
Excellent. So stepping back just a little bit, we've touched on some of these, but in your experience, what are some of the pitfalls of not engaging diverse patients? So I thought maybe Stacy could start with this one from the pharma perspective.
So I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but we now understand so much more than we did before that it is not a one size fits all approach when it comes to diversity and the efficacy of drugs. So there is inherently a need to make sure that your medication is going to go to market and be able to treat patients as efficaciously in one group as it is in another group. And so the understanding that that was a barrier is now very clear. And so obviously one of the pitfalls of not having diverse patients is going to be not being able to assess that efficacy in those patient populations. But in addition, if you are always focused about getting to market quickly, you're always going to be leaving an opportunity behind, right? And so there has been a focus for a very long time about finding PIs who can recruit quickly for these patients that I am looking for that match the patient profile. And what that sacrifices, the speed to market is going to sacrifice for really understanding the true efficacy of the product that you're coming to market with. And so I think that from that perspective, it's become all the more clear that we need to be looking for efficacy. But I think that, to what Alex and Sarah touched on, it goes beyond just efficacy, right? Obviously, there is a need to understand the efficacy of these treatments in the right populations, but it also speaks to trust and confidence, and really making the investment in understanding the diverse patients that we're actually treating.
I can add to that actually a little bit. Just if we look at what are we really missing out on, I often think about this in like four different ways. Of on one side, you got the scientific side of things. You need to prove that safety and efficacy. And so if you are not doing it in the intended patient populations, then you're obviously missing out on that. But you're also going to be missing out on, from a development perspective, you're also going to be missing out on a lot of unknown side effects and problems that will come up post-launch. So having that knowledge ahead of time is often going to be very helpful to kind of drive your development time and financial risks and consequences down as well. And then on a commercial level, the more types of patients that you have tested this in, the more types of patients that you have proven safety and effectiveness in, that is obviously going to drive your faster approval in other geographies, but it's also going to drive the reimbursement of drugs. So from a bottom line perspective, it is effective to do that as well. And then I think we should never forget the social element of, why are we doing this? We need to do this. It's good common practice. Why are we not doing this is probably the better question, instead of saying, why should we be doing this?
Those are all excellent points. So we've spoken mainly about patient populations. I mean, and a lot of people are really focusing on patient populations, but what about investigator diversity, and how important is it, and how do we help facilitate this diversity? Let's start with Stacy.
Oh, I was going to hand it over to Alex. I think she's got the expertise. Please.
Yes, please,
Yeah.
Alexandra.
So from an investigator perspective, I really look at this from my own personal experience often. If I go to another country and I need to sit down with a doctor because I have a medical issue, I've been there, what is the most frustrating piece? You have a language barrier. You don't really understand what that other doctor is saying to you because it's not your primary language. So that trust there between doctor and patient is critical. And that trust doesn't just live based on a language. It also lives on the way that a doctor and a patient look, the kind of background that they have, the kind of, are they part of the same community, things like that. So the closer the doctor and the physician, the doctor and the patient are together, the more likely that bond of trust is going to be there. And I think from that perspective, it is super important that we are not just looking at who is a doctor treating, but also who is this doctor? Does this doctor have the potential to be building the level of trust with the patients that we are trying to target, that we should be targeting? And I think the physician diversity is one of the key steps, one of the key solutions that we should be looking at when we're trying to help solve the diversity challenge in general. First, the patients, who are we trying to target? And then who should we be working with in order to help connect with those patients? And who are the people who are basically speaking the same language as your patients? Not physically the same language, but also on a mental level.
Yeah, I would totally add to that diversity of thought is something we've been focused on a lot lately, in that doctors who are newer to practice, younger doctors, are really thinking more about these issues than some people who have been established in the field for a very long time. And so we're also finding that while it is important to find diverse investigators, it's also important to find those people who we know already, based on their academic work, are focused on these issues and are going to help us really drive that message home. So when we're looking for investigators, we're always looking for those who are leading the way in their scholarship and talking about these issues, because we know that they're going to put diversity in clinical trials really front and center in their practice.
I think it's also,
you had some comments on.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think this is interesting, in that there's the concept of the centers for excellence, the academic medical centers that we typically go to, and there we're not necessarily seeing diverse investigators at an academic medical center, and really thinking about where we want patients to come from, where we or how we want to look at diversity, and then where do we go to get those patients, or where do we go to identify those patients. There are certain communities that we may identify that may be more fitting than the communities around a traditional academic medical center. And that could be, for example, rural communities. Thinking about how do we get investigators in a rural community that might be interested in doing clinical research? Are we even talking to those investigators? But not even thinking about investigators, but also the clinical staff, the folks that are actually making the trial move on a day-to-day basis, making sure that those people are properly trained and gathering interest there, and making sure that they're diverse as well. Interesting. The other interesting piece about this is the same Congresswoman who introduced the DEPICT Act has also mentioned that she may try to introduce legislation on requiring clinical staff diversity. That may be a steeper hill to climb than clinical trial diversity, as far as from a political perspective, from a legislative perspective. But I think it's an interesting conversation that Congress may be having very soon. And maybe we can figure out how do we become a part of that conversation. I think this is definitely a start. But we understand that in order one of the elements that we want to think about in order to achieve greater diversity in clinical trial, we do want to make sure that the investigator and the staff are also representative of those populations.
And maybe
Yeah,
just a
and
last
to
point to add. Sorry.
go ahead.
Just a last point to add to that. Like, if we look at patient testimonials of why did you participate in a clinical trial, and specifically the testimonials of patients that are diverse, in a lot of cases, what we see as a consistency factor there is because the people who were treating me looked and spoke like me. I think that really does speak to that element of it's not just the physicians as such, it's also of course, the medical staff on site that we should be taking into consideration, because the physician is only working with the patient on such a level, whereas the medical staff is in a lot of cases the kind of like the first spokesperson that we should be taking into consideration. So having that, that level of trust between all of those different people and all of those different groups, I think is going to be critical for the success on a longer term.
And so I was going to add to Sarah's comments about where we place clinical trials and thinking about the academic medical center versus the rural community trial sites, is that what we've come to understand, especially with working with our partners, is that it isn't sufficient to just understand the demographics of that zip code. Because the reality is that within a zip code, you can have the perfectly diverse demographics that you're looking for, but that doesn't mean that the investigator sees those patients. And you could think of examples all over the country where you have a very diverse zip code and clinicians who are seeing patients who are coming in from out of that zip code, or clinicians who are in a very non-diverse zip code but have patients who are coming to them who are more diverse. And so what we've learned, especially working with our partners, is that it's a big obstacle to only be looking at the demographics of that geography. And there is a need that we're trying to fill, to be able to understand better really who that PI treats, right? Who are the patients in that investigator site, because they might not match the diversity that is that zip code or that census data. And so one of the things we're really focused on is understanding how to get more information into our site feasibility's hands so that they can make decisions that will really affect encouraging diverse patient populations into their trials.
Excellent. So we're dipping a little bit into geography and patient representation. So what about geography and patient representation? I mean, what should be some of our considerations when making determinations about the geographic location of our trials? We can start with.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think from a geography perspective, the US has kind of been the first goer on we need to do something, we're taking action, and that's great. But what is happening in the US and what diversity means in the United States is not necessarily the same definition of diversity in different locations. From my perspective, again, Europe, the whole element of racial diversity, for example, is less of an issue, whereas for one of the other issues that is coming up much more, which is also very much focused on diversity, is whether patients or people in general have actually been migrating. Because that migration background is one of the key factors that drives again the diversity within the patients that we're trying to target here. So, and this is just Europe, US. Each different geography is going to have a very different approach into what does diversity mean in the different locations and how should we think about solving that. So I think it's good that we now have a first kind of model that we can start to work against. But I think for each of the different geographies, we're going to have to be really careful that we are redefining what does diversity mean within each of the geographies before we can really start to say, okay, and now we're going to try and fix some or try to create a solution, try to create guidelines and things like that in order to solve against it, because it might not necessarily mean the same thing in the number of different places. So we're always going to be able to start from the same benchmarking points. Yes, sure, there is a difference, male, female, age, things like that, but everything else can be very, very different. And it's really important that we're taking that into consideration, that the world is just a very diverse place in general.
Yeah, the other thing is census data in the United States is still 10 years behind, right? And if we think about the changing demographics of the populations in America and how much they've shifted, we really need to have, the most recent information. The demographics, COVID had a huge impact on the demographics of a lot of states and a lot of cities. And I think that that'll take some time to really understand. So relying on what we know about general demographic and census, and like Alex said, the migrations, the wars that we've had in Europe and the migrations that have occurred from them have really impacted things that you can't necessarily understand without really understanding who these clinicians are actually seeing. And so I think that it is always important to have geographic representation, because we know that there's going to be variability there that's important, but it's even more important to really understand not just the fact that this clinician works in this city or in this town, but that they actually have access to the patients that we're interested in recruiting.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to turn a bit over to big data. How can big data fuel trial diversity? So now we're really looking at how do we actually solve some of these problems? And do you have any specific examples of big data use in practice? I thought we'd start with maybe Stacy and Alexandra, and then we can maybe discuss some of that a little bit after we look at that. So,
Alexandra, do you want to?
Alexandra,
I think,
go ahead.
yeah, I think one of the things that Stacy has already mentioned is it isn't just about someone being able to or has access to the patients as such, but also someone who is able to actually deliver on the recruitment expectations as such. And so I think what we really need to be aware of is a lot of data is actually being generated by the healthcare industry. So we should be looking at how we can start connecting a lot of those different data points back together in order to connect the dots between diversity, bring more diversity and equity into the trials, as well as looking at how well have people been doing. And using all of those data points in order to feed algorithms, to feed predictive modeling systems, things like that, that are basically much faster and much smarter than our human brains in theory, at least. And um, based on those outcomes, we should be looking at how to make selections and how to move forward. So I think we need to kind of take a step back and look at not just diversity as an individual issue, but look at diversity as being an issue part of the bigger puzzle, and how many pieces of that puzzle can we try to fix by connecting more data points, more big data back together in a smarter way, driving insights from that, and really hone in on what those insights are teaching us in order to learn and move forward again, based on, again, insights, learning, and more data being fed into the systems.
So do we ever, sorry, I'm going to go. Do we ever think about data bias? Is there any way that we um, correct to determine if there's any bias in our data in terms of?
So I like
Stacy, go
to
ahead.
think, yeah, I like to think about usually using a triangulation uh, methodology. I don't think any methodology is perfect. And so what we want to do is we want to layer methodologies on top of each other to get the best outcomes. So what does that mean for clinical trial diversity? Right now, the three layers we have are demographic information, right? Census, baseline demographic understanding. We have epidemiology information to understand what the incidences of diseases are in order to make sure that we're matching those incidences to the needs that we have. And then, big data. And so to me, you really triangulate them, right? You want to take those three data points and layer them on top of each other. It's not to say that the epi data isn't valuable or that the census data is not valuable, but it's all three together that are really going to help you. So I think that helps with the biases, right? It will help you make sure that you're not relying. A bias only comes from relying too much on any one data set. And so we don't want to lean 100% into one data set and zero in the other, right? We want to make sure that we're layering these insights on top of each other to make the best decisions for our business. And so with that, we're going to be able to take big data for its value, layer in census and epidemiological data, and make the best decisions for our patients.
So we're running a little into time, so I'm going to make this one our last question, and then we will take questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in your questions and answers tab and submit those, and we will take those at the end here. So, all right. So, looking maybe 3 to 5 years out, I'd like to ask each of you how you see us progressing in this area. What do you see coming up 3 to 5 years out, or where would you like to see things go? I could just start in order, so I could start with Sarah. Yeah,
Yeah, I think that we will see more data. So this is kind of new in a way. It's not new, but it's still new. The concepts that we're talking about right now and the emphasis and the focus on collecting these data and actually using these data for how we communicate to patients is a new concept. Traditionally, subpopulation data was just required to be collected, but not necessarily you do anything with it. It wasn't necessarily so that you were including the data in a label or communicating the information to physicians. So this is definitely something that will be interesting to see as far as how much progress we're making. Are the laws? Is the guidance? Is that going to be helpful? Is that going to move the needle? Or will we need to do something more? The other thing that I think will be interesting will be, as far as the data piece is concerned, the big data piece is concerned, is the use of digital health technology and how that's applied to clinical trials, and whether some of these technologies will potentially solve the problem, whether they add to the problem, or whether we need to think about them in a different way than where we currently are. So I see the next 5 years as there's more information that we will have to further this discussion and hopefully make even more improvements in this area.
I think I'm next on your screen. So I think the next 3 to 5 years will be about three things. I was just kind of jotting them down. First of all, I think there'll be consequences. We've already started to see the FDA reject or delay drug approvals because they weren't tested in the appropriate patient populations. So now that the guidance has been out there, I think we will see consequences. Hopefully companies have gotten ahead of this, and so there won't be as many delays or as many consequences. But I think that we've already started to see that some of those consequences have happened. And so that'll be part of our learning. And then I think that that's the second thing that I noted down is this is draft guidance and it is codified, but it's still asking for a plan. The FDA hasn't specified numbers of requirements. They've specified that you need to have a plan. And there hasn't been a lot of talk about what are the consequences if you plan but you don't succeed. I think that that's what we'll learn, right? We'll learn a lot about what makes a good plan, what happens with a successful plan, what happens with an unsuccessful plan, and how we can learn together. And I hope that there's really an openness within industry to have those conversations, because this is a ship we're all in together, and we're all going to sink or swim together. And so the more openness we have about what went right and what went wrong with our diversity plans will be really important. And then the last thing I think is technology. If you think back to 2015, 2016 and where we are today, 5 years from now, technology is going to accelerate at such a pace that it's hard to imagine how much it'll help us in ways we weren't even thinking of today. But I'm sure, just based on the past couple of years of experience that we've had here at H1, that we know that the technology will be enabling, and it'll really help both sponsors and patients really get the right medications to market faster, safer, and smarter.
I think I'm last on your screen. So from my perspective, I think I'm expecting two things, basically. One is, what is going to be the global output here? I'm expecting to see some evolution, not just in the US of how things are happening, but I'm also expecting that other geographies are going to start adopting similar types of requirements, at least. And that I'm really curious to see what the differences are going to be between the different locations and what the different expectations are going to be, as well as consequences, to Stacey's point. I think the second thing that I'm probably hoping to see or expecting to see is, how is this going to impact the types of data that we are collecting today? If you asked anyone 10 years ago what kind of data would be relevant to change diversity in a clinical trial, I think everyone kind of had an idea of, yeah, this or this would probably be relevant, but no one was really focused on, but what does that really mean compared to what we are collecting today? And I think when we are moving forward in this whole diversity and equity perspective, I think it's going to be really important that we are starting to look at not just what do we want to achieve, but also what do we need in order to achieve it, and where do we need to make changes in order to get there. The differences in data being collected, being allowed to be collected in different locations in the world is already so different. So I'm just wondering how that is also going to be impacted based on this very important diversity and equity need globally.
Now I wish we talked to Sarah the whole time about privacy and diversity, right? It's a whole other conversation with Sarah.
Other conversation.
For sure.
Interesting that you're kind of leading into, or Alexandra was, into a question that we are going to take from the audience now. So that kind of gets us through our panel. And thank you so much for bearing with us and providing such great insights. I'm going to take some of these questions. If you're out there and you have a quick question, you can submit it. Hopefully we can get to it. If we can't get to it, and you've given us permissions, we can come back to you after the event and answer any of your questions one-on-one. So it's worth your time to put them in there. So we have 4 minutes. So let's go ahead and I'm going to ask you more about some stakeholder questions. Within pharma companies, what stakeholders should be moving the needle within these organizations to drive equity and diversity? And this will probably be our last question. So this is
all right. I'll jump in quick and answer this a little bit. So one of the most interesting things when you're in a pharmaceutical company is to see how stakeholders come to the table. And most stakeholders have a specific perspective that they are promoting, whether you're the patient advocacy person, you're the medical affairs person, you're the clinical development, the clinical feasibility person. And what that really means is we need to have a diversity and inclusion stakeholder at the table. Having them at the table will ensure that that perspective isn't forgotten. There have been so many times where the patient advocate at the table is like, in an obesity trial, they're like, you need to ask, making sure that the chairs are big enough for the patients who are going to be coming to the site. They're thinking about things from that patient perspective, and they make sure that those questions are heard. When you have that diversity person at the table, they're going to make sure the same thing happens. And so it's really about including them at the table as you're discussing the design, feasibility, and execution of the trial.
Yeah, I would add, not being in pharma, but just from this perspective and working with a number of those companies, that it is, to Stacy's point, it is a multidisciplinary conversation, and potentially finding a way to operationalize how you approach those diversity conversations and the way that diversity is implemented in clinical trials. I think the operationalization part is very key here.
Alexandra, do you want to add to this?
I think most things have already been said. I think just making sure that we have the different kinds of people who have the right kind of mindset at the table, but also expects people who are already at the table to start adopting that mindset. It shouldn't just be we need to bring a diversity stakeholder to the table. It should also be everyone at the table should already have that mindset of what does this mean from a patient perspective and from a specifically a diverse patient population perspective, and what does it take for us to make it into a success?
Excellent. Well, it looks like we all have 30 seconds. So at that, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for attending this Fierce Biotech webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd also like to thank our speakers and panelists. Thank you so much for participating. We enjoyed it and are very grateful for your perspectives, each and every one of you. Thank you. And then H1, thank you for making today's webinar possible. Final note, this webinar has been recorded and you'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. If you have colleagues that would like to access the webinar, they'll go register and we'll send them a unique link. And thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.